My father was from the village of Borytsy in the western Ukraine, and his part of the country ended up on the losing side of the First World War. There was a lot of unrest after the war, and he told me once he wanted to escape being conscripted into the Romanian army, but I think he wanted land of his own. To honor my father, I told the story of his adventures as an emigrant to Canada in a series of paintings. A lot of people had left his village for Canada before the war, but my grandfather didn't want him to go. Father finally got his way, though, and had his passage arranged with a sponsor here, a Mr. Kurelek. He left from Hamburg, and they stopped at Liverpool on the way, so there were a lot of immigrants on board. Most of them were heading west. He got off the train at Mundare in Alberta and got a lift part of the way. But he had to walk the last 8 miles in the snow. And when he got to the house, most of the family were away hauling grain. So Mrs. Kurelek gave him something to eat and sent him to bed. Grain prices were better in winter, and farmers had less to do. So they would get up at 4 to load the grain, and after breakfast they would haul it along the North Saskatchewan to the elevators at Bellis. Sometimes it went to 30, 40 below, and the drivers would have to get down and walk behind the sleigh to build up their body heat again. It was an 18-mile trip each way, and it would take them most of the day to do it. I think he worked 2 years to pay off his passage. I know he stayed longer than he had to. He didn't know where else to go. And although he doesn't say so, I think my mother had something to do with it. They were married in a little Orthodox church in Shandro. My grandfather was one of the most prosperous farmers in the district, so they had to have a big celebration. I did a painting a few years ago of a similar party at the home of some friends in Manitoba, the Tomics. Father said it went on for 3 days. They didn't have a honeymoon. They just loaded up their gifts and went to work on the land that was part of my mother's dowry. I was born 2 years later, and I remember when I was small, Father was in bed all one summer with a stomach ailment. My mother had to run the farm while he looked after me as best he could. The hired man got the profits that year. We farmed in Alberta for 8 years before the Depression hit us. I don't think it was the hail or frost as much as the low grain prices that made Father look for a new farm. Some cousins of Father's, the Bujaks, had written of a good buy near Stonewall. So in 1934, he sold what was left of a crop hit by frost and went to Manitoba to see. My first impression was the size. It was about a quarter mile from the barn to the house. It had been a dairy farm, and it must have been a good buy. The house alone had 17 rooms. My mother looked after us, and we looked after the herd. All Father was interested in was the land. Father was the first to see the grasshoppers. We were at school. They were coming over some bogland to the east of our farm. He said they just looked like a funny yellow cloud. There were millions of them, 3 and 4 to a head. I remember my brother John and I running up and down the pasture, scooping them up in midair to feed to the chickens. The landlord, Mr. Kern, told Father not to worry about the mortgage. Just save what he could as feed for the herd. Just as in Western novels, where cattlemen look down on sheep herders, so Father looked down on dairymen. But it was only the milk money and his determination to pull through that kept us going that winter. The kitchen was always the focal spot in the house, especially in winter. It was the only room that kept us warm. We spent that winter eating drought potatoes dipped in grease from an old cow we had slaughtered. The animals ate better than we did. By the time John, Winnie, and I had left for high school in Winnipeg, good crops and wartime prices had really put my father back on his feet. We would go back at harvest time, and I remember him standing on the thresher as we all worked into the night to get the crops in. He bought a house for us in Winnipeg, so we would all be together and save on the rent money. My parents would bring in the groceries every weekend, and we were all doing well in school, so he began to think about selling the farm and retiring to the city. The machinery auctioneer came out early to offer Father $5,000 on the spot for everything, and he accepted. But when he tried to lower it to $4,500, Father said no. So I had to keep track of the bids.
Who says $1 for the sale? Anybody $1?
And when it was over, we had netted $8,700. And the auctioneer was so mad he could have spit. Father was depressed for a long time after the sale. And finally, he decided to try and sort of half-retire on a smaller farm. So he came east and settled near Hamilton, Ontario. Oh, in the end, he did revive, and he bought more land. He doesn't know what to do with himself if he isn't working. Well, we all go out to the farm to visit and help out. But you know, in the old country, the farmer died happy if one of his sons took over the land. But this is a new country, and traditions change. And although my father wanted his children to become professional people, I think it bothers him a little bit that none of us turned out to be farmers.